Hi. In this video I'm going to talk about flowing, or how to take notes during an APTA debate round. If you're not familiar with the general structure of an APTA round, I suggest you go back and watch our basic rules video and then come back to this one when you're ready. When it comes to taking notes during a round, I really have one huge piece of advice for you, and that is do it. Somehow, whatever way works for you. Because it's not going to be enough, no matter how clever you are and no matter how good you think your memory is. It's just not going to cut it to get up in the front of the room and give your entire speech totally on the fly. You'll need some little reminders of what the big ideas were in the round and what you're planning to say about them. So in order to have a good note-taking method, you need something that will keep track of all those main ideas in the round, the key areas of analysis, or the independent points, as we call them. You'll also need to make sure that your method keeps track of responses to those points, and responses to responses, and responses to responses to responses, and so on, because that's what makes it a debate round in the first place. So the method of flowing works pretty well for the vast majority of debaters on APTA. It's not in any way enforced. It's just a sort of tradition and method that we pass down to each other. So you should feel free to tweak it and customize it for whatever works for you. The most important thing I would remind you about is to add your own shorthand and abbreviations so that you can keep up with your note-taking even while you're planning and listening and maybe talking to your partner and so on. So when we talk about the flow, we're talking about the layout, the structure of the arguments in the round. We're also talking about your physical notes. So you'll be taking notes probably on 2 pieces of paper or the front and back of one sheet. Some people write small enough that they can fit it all on the front of one page, and some people prefer to write on more. But in general, you just need enough room that you can divide it up by speeches and by the side of the round. Now, by side of the round, I mean, are we talking about the government's independent points or the opposition's independent points? So for a general schematic, I'll show you as though we were taking our notes on one side of one piece of paper. It's yellow and it's longer than it is tall because I've drawn it as though it's a legal pad that's been turned on its side, which a lot of people find is a good method to use. If you were writing on 2 pieces of paper, the top row here would be 1 page and the bottom row would be your 2nd page. But for our purposes, this top row is our on-case arguments and the bottom row is our off-case arguments. So on-case refers to points that are related to the government's independent points that they put forth in the beginning of the round, and off-case means it's related to the opposition's independent points. Alright, so here I've taken our schematic and blown it up to fill the entire screen. And we're going to focus just on the first column. This is where the PMC, the Prime Minister's Constructive, is going to go. Now, we're actually just going to be focusing on the upper left region of the page because there are no opposition arguments in the PMC speech. So we don't need that box at all, so I've just drawn a big red X over it. The first thing we're going to write about the Prime Minister's speech is the case statement and any necessary details you might want to know, bits of clarification questions or exactly how they're implementing their plan. So I've just written something generic here for the purposes of illustration, but you should leave a little bit of room to get all the details you want to remember. As they go through their speech, they should have clearly signposted and numbered arguments. So you want to write down what the number is for the argument, what tagline they use for it, and the key important subpoints, which probably won't and probably shouldn't be individually lettered or numbered, but there will be some key ideas within each point, and you want to make sure you get each one of them down. Sometimes it might be relevant to write a particular example down if you want to be able to respond to it later. So here's their first argument, say it's about individual rights. Maybe their second argument is about economic efficiency, and their argument number 3 might be about the image in the international community. And like I said, this is just a generic speech. I just picked some common arguments and threw them together. But one thing that you'll notice is that I have a little bit of my own shorthand in here. Under point number 2, I wrote the marginal utility of money, so I generally use $1 sign to mean money, an actual amount of currency, and $2 or $sign in a circle to mean the economy or something more generally about money. I use an upward pointing arrow to mean increasing or improving or any sort of general upward connotated sort of motion. So here I have improved allocation of resources within society denoted with this upward arrow. But like I said, come up with whatever shorthand works for you. You just need to be able to listen and write and talk and plan at the same time. So that's our PMC speech. When we move on to the LOC, we're going to shift to the next column, and we're basically looking at these two boxes. The speech begins, though, in the lower half of the page, because the first thing the Leader of Opposition is going to do is introduce his or her own arguments, separately affirming the opposition side before they go back to disagree with what the Prime Minister said. So again, we're going to have numbers and taglines and important sub-areas of analysis. Probably we'll have 3 again, and one thing that you might end up having to do is keep track of particular points of information that are asked, and you can just put those right into the flow wherever they happen to occur if you want to remember that a particular question was asked or that an answer was phrased in a particular way. Maybe you want to be able to use the fact that the Leader of Opposition brought up the Affordable Care Act to show some sort of internal contradiction in their philosophy, something like that. So maybe you would note that POI here. And you could just go right back into the flow with their third point and whatever subpoints it might have. After the LO has finished dealing with their independent points, they'll go back up to case side, and they'll respond to the individual rights point. Maybe they'll say, hey, those rights aren't actually unlimited. Here are some examples. In response to economic efficiency, maybe they'll bring up some concerns about the cost of implementing this plan, what this new law would require. And in response to the international community, maybe they have a different perspective on geopolitics and international relations. Now, we call this the flow because you could imagine these arguments physically flowing down the page. We can draw some arrows to make that a little more clear, and depending on how neat your handwriting is, you might want to draw these arrows on your own page to show this part is a response to this, or to say maybe there are several responses to one point, so you can show all of the different arrows coming out of that. I'm not going to keep drawing arrows on this document, but you might find arrows handy to use for yourself. So next we have the MG's speech, which is going to happen in this third column. In the unlikely event that there's some new point that the MG is going to introduce, that would go in the upper box near the bottom as a point number 4 on the Gov side, but in general this probably shouldn't happen because the government side knows the case ahead of time, and the MG shouldn't be keeping an argument secret just to have something new to say here. They should be able to add new analysis to all of these points without saving a separate argument for themselves. So let's just assume for the purposes of this example that there is no separate new argument that the MG is making, and they're just going to begin right away with addressing the Leader of the Opposition's independent points. So they'll have some response to the paternalism argument about when we should let people make judgments about their own costs and benefits. And they have some arguments in response to the second point about federal jurisdiction versus states' rights, and some response to the third point about setting precedent. So again, you see this theme of the flow with the separate arguments carrying from left to right across the page, and we're numbering them the same here so that you can see that ops point 1 becomes this point 1 response in the MG, and so on down the page. After that, the MG will go back case side and rebuild what their partner already talked about by responding to the arguments that the LO made, trying to tear them down. So suppose that this is what our MG says in response to the LO's case side analysis. You might notice that there's sort of a big gaping hole here, and I would actually mark that on my own flow with sort of oval to say there's nothing here, there's something missing here. That's something I would do as a judge or as a member of the other team listening to this speech. And this might have happened accidentally, or it might have just happened on purpose. Maybe they just decided they wanted to ignore that, but that's how you might note what's called a dropped argument on your flow. Finally, we would move on to the member of the opposition speech in this fourth column. And again, no big surprises here. Say that we have our responses that we would begin off case, dealing with the LO, what was originally the LO's independent points, and then going back up to talk about the case side arguments. Now, it's somewhat more likely that the MO would have a new point that the LO didn't come up with, and you would basically write that sort of right below where my face is, a number 4 point there, explaining what the new idea is. But in general, there's nothing special going on here, except that we have the MO calling out the dropped argument that the MG made in point 2 on case side. So one way you might want to mark that is with a huge arrow saying basically the LO's analysis flows across to this point in the MO's speech. So that's basically it. That's how you flow the constructive speeches in a round. Now, at this point, you may be asking yourself, what about the rebuttal speeches? What about the LOR and the PMR? I thought those were sort of a big deal, and they are. But the thing you actually have to remember is, in a real round, you're going to be taking notes only as long as you personally need to for the speeches that you're going to be giving. So what that means is it differs for each speaker within the round, depending on their position. The MO is going to need to flow longer than the MG, and so on. Now, as a judge, you definitely need to write down what is said during the rebuttals, and you can just write that wherever you have empty space, whether it's in that unused box on your flow underneath the PMC, or on the back of a page, or on a separate page. Just write down what's said, what the crystallization points are, however works for you. But when it comes to planning your speech, well, in general, for the pre-rebuttal, the constructive speeches, you can actually plan those right in the flow. You can write in the boxes where you know you're going to be speaking and outline the speech you intend to give. As far as planning rebuttals, though, I would personally recommend that you sketch those out on a separate page, because often rebuttal speeches, because they have to be so big picture, can take some serious organization, and maybe you'll rearrange things as the round goes on. So it's not such a big deal that the rebuttals themselves aren't part of the flow as such that we've talked about so far. Finally, I have a couple tips on how to improve your flowing if you already have the basics down, or just some ideas to keep in mind as you get more and more practice with flowing. So first, some common pitfalls that I would caution you about. One is not having written clearly or large enough so that you can read your own handwriting when you stand in front of the room. Now, again, this goes back to what I've said several times already about developing your own shorthand. You want to be able to write down complex ideas or long phrases quickly and succinctly so that you can look at it and immediately know what it was you were talking about. And that's something that you'll have to work out for yourself, and with experience it will come. There's also another issue that's common. Well, it's really sort of two issues, two sides of the same coin. Some people tend to take really copious notes on the speech that they're listening to, but sort of forget to plan the speech that they're about to give. And other people sort of do the opposite, where they maybe tune out the speech that they're listening to and spend lots of time planning their own points. But then they end up having to respond to something and they're not really sure what was said. So obviously the correct strategic decision is somewhere in between those two extremes, and exactly where in between depends on your own comfort level and your needs as a debater. So this is just something that you want to be aware of as you're flowing and as you're debating in rounds, to try to tweak that and compensate appropriately so that you can deliver the speeches that you need to. Finally, of course, as with so much in debate, practice makes perfect, or at least makes a whole lot better than before. So I would recommend that you flow other people's rounds. One great idea is to watch videos of rounds on Parley Debate. There are lots there, and you can watch those with your teammates and then compare flows afterwards. I would also recommend that you stick around to watch out rounds at tournaments whenever possible and flow those rounds. In some cases, you might even be able to ask the debaters in the round if you could take a look at their flow and compare it to yours and see what they thought was worth writing down versus what you did. The most important thing, though, is your own rounds. The more practice you get in debate rounds, applying these techniques to your own arguments and your opponent's arguments, the better you will be at making your flow meet your needs within debate. So that is the number one thing you can do to get better. Just keep debating. So best of luck. Have fun.